Modern society teaches men to fear solitude as if it were a symptom of failure. From childhood, boys are conditioned to associate loneliness with rejection instead of transformation. If you are alone, they assume something must be wrong with you. Perhaps you are unattractive, perhaps unsuccessful, perhaps emotionally damaged. But Unamuno saw something entirely different. He believed solitude was not always a punishment. Sometimes it was initiation. Sometimes life removes noise from a man because noise is preventing his birth. He once wrote, "Only he who attempts the absurd is capable of achieving the impossible." But what people fail to understand is that Unamuno's absurdity was not about public ambition. It was about inner confrontation. The absurd man is the one willing to descend into his own darkness without anesthetic. Most men spend their entire lives fleeing inward examination. They drown themselves in entertainment, relationships, cheap status games, endless talking, and shallow routines because stillness forces revelation. And revelation is terrifying when a man secretly suspects he has built his entire identity on performance. This is why loneliness changes certain men so violently. Not because loneliness itself contains magic, but because it removes witnesses. It strips away applause. It takes away seduction, distraction, imitation, and social theater. And when all of that disappears, a man finally hears the machinery inside himself. He begins to discover whether he possesses genuine principles or merely borrowed opinions. Unamuno believed most people are not individuals at all. They are echoes wearing human skin. Their beliefs are inherited. Their desires are socially manufactured. Their personalities are negotiated through fear of exclusion. But the lonely man begins mutating into something else entirely. There comes a point in prolonged isolation where a man either collapses psychologically or develops terrifying clarity. This is the threshold modern culture tries desperately to prevent men from reaching. Because clarity makes a man difficult to manipulate. Once a man no longer fears being alone, entire industries lose power over him. Seduction loses leverage. Social approval loses leverage. Trends lose leverage. Even humiliation loses leverage. The man who can survive isolation without self-hatred becomes politically, emotionally, and spiritually dangerous. Unamuno himself lived in constant contradiction. He was deeply spiritual, yet plagued by doubt. He desired immortality while intellectually wrestling with meaninglessness. He admired faith while simultaneously interrogating it like an enemy. But this tension gave birth to one of his most powerful insights. A strong man is not a man without inner conflict. A strong man is one who can endure contradiction without escaping into delusion. Weak men rush toward certainty because certainty comforts them. Powerful men tolerate ambiguity because they understand reality itself is fractured. This is why intelligent men often become lonelier with age, not because they hate humanity, not because they are antisocial, but because they begin noticing how little of ordinary conversation is real. They hear people speaking endlessly without ever revealing themselves. They notice relationships built entirely on mutual distraction. They notice how most romance is negotiation disguised as love. They notice how modern masculinity has become performative exhaustion, men competing to appear desirable while secretly feeling spiritually replaceable. And slowly, they withdraw. Not always physically, sometimes psychologically, sometimes emotionally. A man can sit in a crowded room while internally existing on another planet entirely. Unamuno understood this isolation intimately. He knew the burden of being unable to fully participate in collective illusions. He once suggested that suffering is proof of consciousness itself. Animals experience pain, but human beings experience tragedy because they are aware of time, death, loss, and meaning simultaneously. The more conscious a man becomes, the heavier existence feels upon his nervous system. That is why shallow men appear happier. They are protected by incomprehension, but the awakened man begins seeing invisible things. He notices manipulation beneath politeness. He notices fear beneath confidence. He notices insecurity beneath arrogance. He notices loneliness hidden inside modern female attention. He notices that many people do not actually want truth. They want emotional sedation. And this realization creates distance between himself and the world around him, not out of superiority, but exhaustion. Because once a man sees deeply enough, ordinary interactions begin feeling theatrical. Unamuno warned about something few modern philosophers discuss: the tragedy of becoming emotionally homeless in a civilization obsessed with appearances. This happens when a man's interior world becomes too vast for shallow environments. He can still function socially. He can still laugh, still work, still speak, but internally he feels increasingly exiled from collective consciousness. He realizes most people are terrified of depth because depth destroys convenient illusions. At first, loneliness feels like abandonment. A man sits in silence and interprets the silence as evidence that he has been forgotten. He watches others move in groups, laugh in clusters, disappear into relationships, marriages, social rituals, and endless digital noise, while he remains alone with thoughts too heavy to casually discuss. But Miguel de Unamuno believed there is a sacred brutality hidden inside this condition. Because when a man survives isolation long enough, something strange begins happening to his perception. He stops seeing companionship as proof of value. He starts asking whether most companionship was ever genuine to begin with. This is where intelligent men separate themselves from emotionally dependent men. The dependent man uses people like emotional oxygen tanks. He cannot regulate his own inner world, so he constantly seeks external stabilization. Attention becomes medication. Romance becomes anesthesia. Validation becomes nourishment. Without these things, he feels psychologically starved. But Unamuno saw this dependency as a subtle form of slavery. He believed modern people often mistake emotional consumption for love itself. What they call intimacy is frequently just mutual escape from solitude. And this is why many men panic the moment a woman leaves them, not because they lost love, but because they lost distraction from themselves. The modern world never teaches men how to metabolize existential pain. It teaches achievement, seduction, performance, competition, but it rarely teaches inner endurance. So when loneliness arrives, most men interpret it as failure instead of training. They immediately rush to replace the silence. Another relationship, another vice, another obsession. Anything to prevent the terrifying encounter with their own unfinished soul. That is why solitude becomes unbearable for weak men and transformative for strong men. The weak man enters loneliness and immediately seeks escape because he experiences his own interior world as hostile territory. But the stronger man remains there long enough for a different process to occur. At first he feels anxiety, then grief, then confusion, then existential exhaustion. But eventually, beneath all those layers, he discovers something society almost never teaches directly. The self is not found through constant connection to others. The self is discovered through surviving separation without psychological collapse. Unamuno once explored the idea that every human being lives with a tragic contradiction inside them. Men desire permanence while living in a temporary body. They crave certainty while existing inside mystery. They seek love while fearing exposure. They pursue greatness while knowing death erases nearly everything. Most people cope with these contradictions by distracting themselves until death arrives quietly enough to avoid deep reflection. But certain men refuse this strategy entirely. Certain men stare directly into existence until they develop a strange kind of spiritual endurance that ordinary people mistake for coldness. This is why many powerful men appear emotionally distant even when they care deeply. They have learned that uncontrolled emotional expression often weakens perception. The modern world romanticizes impulsive vulnerability without understanding that indiscriminate exposure can fragment a man psychologically. Unamuno admired emotional depth, but he also understood the importance of interior discipline. A man should not become emotionally numb, but neither should he become emotionally chaotic. The strongest men feel intensely while maintaining command over themselves. Their silence is not emptiness. Their silence is containment. And women often sense this before they intellectually understand it. There is something unsettling about a man who no longer radiates need, not because he becomes cruel or indifferent, but because he is no longer unconsciously begging for emotional rescue. Most male behavior in modern society is saturated with subtle desperation. Men seek validation through achievement, sexuality, humor, status, and constant performance because they fear becoming invisible. But the solitary man slowly escapes this prison. He learns how to exist without constantly demanding reassurance from the external world. And once a man develops that ability, his presence changes completely. Unamuno would likely argue that loneliness forces a man to confront one of the most painful realizations imaginable. Very few people will ever fully understand him, not because he is superior, but because consciousness itself is isolated. Every human being suffers internally in ways language can only partially communicate. Every man carries silent wars nobody else can completely enter. And intelligent men eventually stop expecting total understanding from others because they recognize the impossibility of fully translating the soul. This realization initially feels tragic, but over time it becomes liberating. A man who no longer demands perfect understanding from the world becomes far less emotionally fragile. This is also why loneliness sharpens discernment. The isolated man becomes increasingly sensitive to emotional falseness because he has spent enormous time observing his own mind carefully. He notices when people speak in rehearsed language rather than authentic thought. He notices how many conversations are dominated by performance instead of sincerity. He notices how modern relationships are often built around temporary emotional convenience rather than genuine loyalty. And because he notices these things, he becomes slower to trust, slower to attach, and slower to surrender his inner world casually. But there is danger in this path as well. Unamuno warned indirectly against turning suffering into identity. Some lonely men become intoxicated by their own alienation. They begin worshipping isolation itself. They confuse emotional withdrawal with wisdom. They develop superiority complexes to protect themselves from vulnerability, and eventually they become spiritually frozen, capable of analysis but incapable of intimacy. This is not strength. This is fear disguised as intelligence. The goal of solitude is not permanent detachment from humanity. The goal is purification of perception so that a man can return to human connection without illusion. That is the crucial distinction modern men miss entirely. The purpose of loneliness is not bitterness, it is refinement. A man enters solitude fragmented and emotionally dependent, but if he survives the process correctly, he emerges with clearer vision, stronger boundaries, calmer emotions, and greater resistance to manipulation. He no longer loves from starvation. He no longer speaks merely to be accepted. He no longer performs masculinity theatrically because his identity is no longer assembled from external reactions. He becomes quieter, but far more solid internally. And this is why the loneliest men often become the strongest. Not because suffering automatically creates greatness, but because certain men use suffering to excavate themselves honestly. They stop running from difficult truths. They stop demanding that life remain comfortable before they develop discipline. They stop expecting the world to constantly validate their existence. Instead, they begin constructing meaning deliberately through endurance, reflection, self-mastery, and conscious living. That process is slow, painful, often invisible to outsiders, but it produces a kind of man modern society no longer understands. A man who can stand alone without collapsing into self-hatred becomes extraordinarily difficult to control. He cannot be manipulated easily through fear of abandonment because he has already survived emotional isolation. He cannot be bribed cheaply through validation because he no longer depends entirely on praise to stabilize his identity. He cannot be psychologically dominated through loneliness because loneliness has already educated him. and that is precisely why modern culture works so aggressively to keep men distracted. A distracted man consumes endlessly. A self-aware man begins questioning everything. So if you are currently walking through loneliness, do not interpret it too quickly as evidence of failure. Sometimes isolation is not life rejecting you. Sometimes it is life separating you from noise so you can finally hear your own mind clearly. Sometimes the collapse of certain relationships is necessary because your spirit can no longer survive inside shallow environments. And sometimes the painful silence you are experiencing right now is the beginning of psychological independence rather than the end of your happiness. Miguel de Unamuno understood that the human soul is forged through struggle, contradiction, longing, and confrontation with mortality itself. He knew that the strongest men are rarely born from comfort. They are shaped slowly through solitude, disappointment, existential tension, and the refusal to lie to themselves. Those men become calmer, sharper, less naive, less desperate, more dangerous to manipulation, and eventually they stop asking the world for permission to exist authentically. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, then carry it forward. Share it with men who are silently fighting battles nobody sees. Subscribe for more philosophical explorations that challenge modern illusions and strengthen the masculine mind. And remember this carefully: the man who survives loneliness without surrendering his soul often becomes the very man the world cannot break afterward.